In the final desperate years of the Pacific War, Japan faced a nightmare its admirals had long feared. The empire stretched across thousands of miles, but the ships needed to sustain it were disappearing one after another. Fuel, ammunition, food, even basic medicine were running dry. Factories had metal but no oil. Warships had guns but no fuel. And entire island garrisons waited for supplies that would never come. This is the story of the secret Japanese convoys, lifelines that tried to slip across American submarine-infested waters, convoys that carried the last hopes of the empire, and yet vanished into the Pacific without ever being seen again. In 1943, Japanese intelligence realized something terrifying. American submarines were no longer simply harassing shipping. They were hunting with purpose. Wolfpacks, groups of submarines coordinated by radio, were now forming lines across key sea routes. A Japanese convoy could leave the home islands and be tracked from the moment it exited port. To survive, Japan decided to create new, ultra-secret convoys. These were not the usual, slow-moving merchant fleets. They were small, fast groups chosen from the best remaining ships. Their missions were classified even within the Navy. Some were disguised under false radio call signs. Others were given cover stories, claiming they were transporting civilians or industrial equipment. But most carried something far more crucial: fuel. By late 1943, Japan's fuel situation was catastrophic. The empire relied on oil from the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. But getting that oil to Japan required traveling through seas now dominated by the U.S. submarine force. A single convoy could decide whether Japan's aircraft flew tomorrow, or whether entire fleets stayed anchored, helpless. The convoys were given code names: High, Moda, Take, Tama, and later, the infamous Tama 33 and High 87. Their schedules were erratic. Their routes zigzagged to avoid known submarine patrol lines. Destroyers carried new sonar sets and depth charges, and every ship traveled in blackout conditions, with no lights, no radios, and strict silence. Still, the Americans were waiting. One of the earliest disasters struck a convoy renamed Moda 01. It carried vital aviation fuel, rubber, and spare aircraft parts from Singapore to Japan. Just hours after leaving port, the American submarine USS Bowfin picked up its trail. Bowfin stalked the convoy for an entire day, waiting for the perfect firing angle. In the dead of night, the submarine struck. Torpedoes ripped through a tanker carrying high-octane aviation fuel, sending a column of fire into the sky so bright it could be seen for miles. The escort commander panicked. Instead of protecting the remaining ships, he began dropping depth charges wildly, losing track of the convoy entirely. By sunrise, half the ships were gone. Japan listed the convoy as delayed. In reality, it never arrived. But that was only the beginning. In 1944, the empire attempted something even more ambitious: a series of super convoys that carried nearly the entire fuel stockpile of Southeast Asia. These were convoys High 71 and High 76, escorted by some of Japan's last operational destroyers. The goal was simple: deliver enough oil to keep the combined fleet alive. American codebreakers discovered the operation within hours. As High 71 left Singapore, several submarines quietly took position. USS Flasher, USS Harder, USS Bluefish, and the legendary USS Rasher formed a deadly net. They didn't need to attack immediately. They simply shadowed the convoy, reporting its position to other wolfpacks. Japan, thinking the route was clear, pushed the convoy north at full speed. Then the storm struck, literally. A typhoon scattered the Japanese ships, isolating tankers and splitting escorts from their charges. In the chaos, Rasher found the convoy's largest prize, the escort carrier Teiyo, a floating jewel that carried aircraft, spare engines, and hundreds of trained mechanics. Rasher fired 6 torpedoes, sending the carrier to the bottom with nearly all hands. Hours later, as surviving ships fled into the darkness, USS Bluefish attacked the tankers still carrying precious oil. Flames spread across the sea as tanker after tanker exploded. What had started as Japan's proudest supply effort turned into a massacre. Only a handful of ships ever reached Japan, and even worse, some arrived empty. Forced to maneuver wildly to avoid attacks, several tankers dumped fuel to prevent catastrophic fires if hit. What mattered most is this: the fuel meant to power Japan's aircraft and battleships never arrived. The combined fleet's tanks were nearly dry. From here, the Japanese High Command faced a choice: abandon distant island garrisons or attempt one last supply effort to save them. Most garrisons were already starving. Some hadn't received supplies in over 6 months. Troops were eating roots, insects, and sometimes the leather from their own boots. Yet Tokyo insisted these islands must not fall. So new convoys were assembled, smaller, faster, and even more deeply classified. These became known as the Take convoys. Operating between the Philippines and Japan, they tried to run supplies southward while returning with wounded soldiers and evacuated personnel. But every departure was a gamble. The Americans had turned the Luzon Strait into a kill zone. Submarine wolfpacks waited along the Bashi Channel, the narrow gap between Taiwan and the Philippines. Any convoy passing through this corridor would have to fight for its life. Take 01 vanished in the stretch. What happened is still debated. Some historians believe it was struck by multiple submarines in the same night. Others think it may have run directly into one of the heavy surface patrols deployed by the U.S. 7th Fleet. There were no survivors. Japan simply recorded the convoy as missing, a quiet admission that it had disappeared without a trace. By mid-1944, the losses were so devastating that Japan created yet another category of convoys, the Tama series. These were emergency reinforcement runs to bring troops to the Philippines before the coming American invasion. The Empire hoped that by reinforcing Luzon, it could force the United States into a long, brutal land campaign. But without fuel, without escorts, and without air cover, the Tama convoys were doomed before they even sailed. Tama 05 was among the most tragic. Packed with thousands of soldiers, many barely teenagers, the convoy set out with only a few small escorts. American submarines USS Hammerhead and USS Pampanito intercepted the convoy just 2 nights after departure. They attacked from both sides, creating chaos as transports turned in different directions. Soldiers jumped into fuel-covered water as multiple ships went down within minutes. The Empire had thrown its last reserves of manpower into the sea. By now, Japan was losing so many convoys that it began hiding the truth from its own commanders. Reports were sanitized. Losses were described as light damage. Whole convoys were listed as delayed due to weather. Families received no information at all. But on the front lines, the truth could not be hidden. Garrisons on New Guinea, the Solomons, the Marianas, and the Philippines began sending frantic radio messages. "We have no food. No ammunition. No medicine. Situation impossible." Japan tried to keep hope alive with one more desperate plan: a final wave of secret convoys, assembled in silence, carrying the very last shipments of oil and supplies from Southeast Asia. What followed would become one of the most catastrophic supply disasters in naval history. Japan's final convoys were born from desperation. By late 1944, the Empire's industrial heart was starving. Pilots trained for months could not fly because there was no fuel to put in their aircraft. Entire battleships, including Yamato and Musashi before her sinking, sat idle in port, unable to conduct more than short-range operations. Every drop of oil mattered. Every ship that could carry fuel, even old freighters and converted passenger liners, was pressed into service. The Navy gathered what remained of its tanker fleet, aging vessels, many damaged, all exhausted from years of constant sailing. Escort numbers were so low that sometimes a single destroyer had to protect 6 or more ships. Mines, typhoons, Submarines and air patrols turned every voyage into a test of fate. Yet Japanese high command insisted these convoys must sail. On paper, the new convoys had strategic value. One shipment could restore aviation fuel reserves. Another might deliver torpedoes for submarines or carry ammunition to a distant island preparing for a final defense. But in reality, the Empire was asking the impossible, to slip through an ocean now controlled almost entirely by the United States. In December 1944, a particularly crucial convoy departed Singapore under heavy secrecy. Its codename was High 87, but within the Navy it had an unofficial nickname, the Last Lifeline. It carried high-octane aviation fuel for what remained of Japan's aircraft forces. It also carried diesel for submarines, lubrication oil for factories, and barrels of rubber and tin, critical materials for the war effort. The convoy tried everything to conceal its movement. It sailed at night, hid under tropical rainstorms, and used deceptive zigzag patterns. The escorts deployed new tactics, aggressive sonar sweeps, drifting listening devices, and even false signal broadcasts to confuse American codebreakers. The ships traveled with complete blackout, their hulls blending into the dark water. But none of it mattered. American intelligence had already intercepted messages revealing the convoy's departure. 3 U.S. submarines, USS Redfish, USS Spadefish, and USS Sea Devil, moved into position long before the convoy reached the open sea. Redfish struck first. Moving silently through choppy waters, it fired a spread of torpedoes at the lead tanker. The impact threw fire into the sky. The blaze illuminated the entire convoy, revealing every ship to the submarines lurking nearby. Panic erupted. Some escorts chased shadows. Others dropped depth charges at empty patches of ocean. The Japanese formation collapsed. Spadefish waited for this moment. In the chaos, it slipped beneath the convoy and fired torpedoes into a second tanker. Fuel poured into the water. Flames spread rapidly, forming a burning slick that trapped smaller vessels. Those who jumped overboard were caught between fire and sea. By dawn, only fragments of the convoy were still afloat. Most of the precious fuel was lost, and with it, Japan's last hope of resurrecting its air force. The pattern repeated again and again. No matter how secret the convoys were, no matter how carefully they sailed, American submarines had mastered the art of the ambush. Their torpedoes worked flawlessly. Their commanders were experienced, and the Pacific was simply too vast for Japan to defend. In early 1945, a final series of missions attempted to reach the Philippines. The situation there was catastrophic. Japanese forces on Luzon and Mindanao were nearly out of ammunition. Soldiers were eating tree bark. Hospitals had no morphine. Commanders begged Tokyo for supplies, even if they could be delivered only by submarine. So Japan assembled the Take and Tama convoys one last time. These were not large fleets anymore, just a handful of ships. Some convoys consisted of a single transport and a single escort. Others had no escorts at all and sailed with only the hope of avoiding detection. One of the most tragic examples was a convoy internally referred to as Convoy X. Records are limited, because the mission was so secret that only a few officers even knew its purpose. It carried several hundred tons of ammunition, rations, and medical supplies for Japanese troops still fighting in northern Luzon. It also carried wounded soldiers returning to the home islands. Only 2 ships made up the convoy, a transport and an aging destroyer with engine problems. They left under cover of darkness. Their orders were to avoid radio communication at all costs, but as they approached the Luzon Strait, USS Batfish detected faint engine noise. The submarine tracked the convoy for hours before launching its attack. 2 torpedoes struck the transport. Ammunition detonated, tearing the ship apart. The destroyer tried to save survivors, but another spread of torpedoes sent it to the bottom as well. Not a single man reached land. Tokyo never admitted the convoy existed. As losses mounted, Japan became trapped in a cycle of denial. High command kept demanding more convoys, but there were fewer and fewer ships left to sail them. Crews were exhausted. Many escorts lacked proper fuel and sailed with only partial tanks. Some convoys even ran out of fuel mid-journey and had to drift until a tanker arrived. American submarines found them easily. One U.S. sub commander later wrote in his log, "We didn't hunt them, they came to us." By mid-1945, the Japanese merchant fleet was essentially gone. More than 80% of all transports, tankers, and cargo vessels had been sunk. The empire was strangled. The remaining industrial centers in Japan were grinding to a halt. Railways ran slower. Trucks had no gasoline. Factories sat idle for days at a time. Even fishing boats, vital for feeding the population, had no fuel to leave harbor. Japan's navy faced an even worse reality. The mighty battleships and cruisers that once dominated the Pacific were now rusting in port. They couldn't move. They couldn't fight. Yamato herself was reduced to a stationary gun platform, firing occasional shells toward American aircraft, nothing more. This fuel starvation was no accident. It was the direct result of a relentless, coordinated campaign by the U.S. submarine force. Their mission was simple: destroy Japan's ability to sustain war. And the key to that mission was destroying the convoys. Yet perhaps the most haunting part of the story lies not with the ships that were sunk, but with the island garrisons these convoys were meant to supply. Across the Pacific, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers were left stranded. They had been promised food, ammunition, reinforcements. They waited for convoys that never came. In New Guinea, starving troops searched for edible plants in the jungle. In the Solomons, soldiers resorted to eating insects and bark. On islands like Wake and Truk, small medical teams tried to treat illness with no medicine at all. Some garrisons held out long after the war ended simply because no one told them Japan had surrendered. The collapse of the convoy system meant the collapse of the empire. By the summer of 1945, Japan struggled to assemble even a handful of ships for one final operation. This was the evacuation of civilians and wounded soldiers from Okinawa. But that convoy, too, came under attack from American submarines and aircraft. The few ships that survived limped back to port with almost nothing to show for their sacrifice. When the war finally ended in August, Japan's ports were filled not with fleets ready to fight, but with skeletal remains of a once mighty maritime empire. Ships half-sunk at anchor, tankers without fuel, freighters stripped for parts, and warehouses stacked with empty barrels that had never been filled. The empire had not been defeated only on the battlefield. It had been starved to death at sea. The story of Japan's secret convoys is the story of a nation fighting against time, distance, and an enemy that controlled the very ocean itself. These convoys were brave, desperate attempts to sustain a war that could no longer be sustained. Many ships sailed in silence, their crews fully aware they might never return, and indeed most did not. Their sacrifice remains one of the forgotten epics of the Pacific War: lost ships, lost supplies, and lost hopes, swallowed forever by the vast, unforgiving Pacific.